It has been over a year since the Dragon debuted at CES, and since then, I don't think a day has gone by where at least someone hasn't asked us about the Nakamichi Dragon. Heck, I have been just as curious as you all have been to hear it, if for no other reason than to finally be able to tell you a review is coming. Well, we finally get to satisfy everyone's curiosity, including my own, so the question that I want answered is this: does the Dragon live up to the hype? Now, Nakamichi has positioned the Dragon to compete more with traditional home theater systems than, say, typical soundbars. Starting with the basics, they state that the Dragon is an 11.4.6 channel Dolby Atmos and DTS:X Pro soundbar. With 31 total drivers and up to 3,000 watts of peak power, the Dragon has a reported frequency response of 20 Hz to 40 kHz and is capable of sound pressure levels of 125 dB. The Dragon has 3 HDMI inputs and 1 HDMI out, which supports ARC and eARC. All of the Dragon's HDMI ports are 2.1 and support signals up to 8K 60 and 4K 120. It can also upscale HD signals up to 4K. The Dragon's HDMI ports can pass through Dolby Vision, HDR, and HDR10+, as well as pass-through gaming features such as VRR, ALLM, and FRL. Other inputs include an optical audio input, an auxiliary input, and there's also an optical audio out and an aux out, which is something I don't think I've ever seen on a soundbar before. There is a USB input, though it is only for firmware updates, which must be carried out using a USB stick due to the Dragon's complete lack of Wi-Fi or Ethernet connectivity. Had features like Wi-Fi and Ethernet been included, this would have enabled over-the-air or network updates, simplifying the user experience. Now, the Dragon does have Bluetooth 5.0 with aptX HD support for, those of you looking for some form of wireless communication. Bluetooth is also used to communicate with the Dragon's control app, which is available for free on both the iOS and Android devices. Since this is our first Nakamichi soundbar product, we weren't really sure what to expect. One thing is for sure, the Dragon system is massive. It's easily one of the largest soundbars we've reviewed, next to maybe the Sennheiser Ambio. While there has been a lot of praise about this bar's build quality, there are equal reports of owners complaining of their bars arriving damaged. And this is surprising because Nakamichi says the Dragon is housed in a one-piece stainless steel chassis, but when you look a little bit closer, you'll find that the bar, its 2 subwoofers, and 2 surround speakers are largely made of plastic, MDF, or just some other form of composite material. Now, I'm not suggesting that you won't find any metal on the bar, it's just the bar is not entirely made of steel. The Dragon's speaker grille is stainless steel, which wraps over the bar's front, side, and upward firing drivers where it meets up with plastic. And I recommend being extra careful when removing this system from the box because the stainless steel is thin and very fragile and can be easily scratched, dented, and marred. Ours was delivered with more than a few scratches, fingerprints, and a couple of minor indentions. And keep in mind, we purchased our unit at retail, and our shipping box features Nakamichi's recently updated added packing material, which is a kind of an acrylic divider to help prevent these known issues that have occurred in shipping. The dual subwoofers and 2 surrounds that come with the Dragon are significantly larger than most of the subs or surrounds typically included with other soundbars. And yeah, their size is impressive, but I wouldn't say that their construction is any better or worse than subs and surrounds that come with a lot of other soundbar systems. I think it's safe to say that one of the main selling points of a soundbar is how easy they are to integrate into your home compared to a, quote, traditional home theater. Now, Nakamichi notes that the Dragon has a setup time of about 15 minutes or less, which is achievable, especially if you've owned a home theater or soundbar before. The Dragon's quick start guide is easy to follow, even for a novice user, and includes steps on where to place the speakers in your room and how to connect the bar to your TV. Once the system is set up, now you can experiment with the Dragon's, quote, house sound, and if you like it, you're basically done. However, if you want to get the most out of the Dragon, including a more coherent sound from top to bottom, plan to set aside as much as an hour and be prepared to grab some tools for this setup. You see, Nakamichi goes after AV receivers pretty hard in their marketing materials, stating that the Dragon is equal to or better than your typical modern AVR, including power and in-channel count. And while this makes for a very impressive marketing campaign, the Dragon lacks a lot of what you'll find in even the most basic receivers. I'm talking about the Nakamichi has no form of automated setup, no EQ, PEQ, nor does it have room correction, which is something that you will find in a $300 WIM amp. So in order to get the very best performance out of the Dragon, you have to enter in your speaker distances and the driver levels manually using a tape measure and an SPL meter, which I'm going to admit is very AVR-like, so long as your AVR is from the mid-90s and not 2024. The Dragon's clunky menu tree and its slow OSD response time further adds to the time it takes to properly set up this system. Regardless, though, I urge you to take the extra time to do this because it will have an effect on the bar's overall performance, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. One of the biggest arguments made for the Dragon has been its subwoofers and how no other soundbar on the market can touch them. After all, it's a .4 system, right? About that, I believe Nakamichi is leaning pretty heavily on semantics by calling the Dragon a 4-channel system with respect to its subwoofers. There are 2 physical subwoofers with this system, each subwoofer containing 2 drivers, which is how Nakamichi is arriving at their .4 status. A quick look at Nakamichi's own menus, and you'll see why calling this a 4-channel subwoofer home theater is a bit of a stretch. While yes, you can turn off each subwoofer driver individually, there is no way to adjust the volume or distance of each driver independently. Even the Dragon's own menus show only a right and left subwoofer. Bass heads, you're going to be the first to point out that there is a world of difference between having 2 subs and 4 when it comes to evenly distributing bass over a wide area. Never mind the fact that there are numerous subwoofers from subwoofer companies that have 2 or more drivers in a single cabinet, and none of those companies are claiming to be more than 1 subwoofer, so I'm really confused about the .4 claims. All that said, credit where credit is due. Even with 2 subs, Nakamichi is going above and beyond what is typical of most soundbar systems, but I think they should have left well enough alone and stated that the system is 11.2, not 11.4. In my opinion, this would have been a more honest approach, even though this would reduce the Dragon's total channel count from 17 to 15, which obviously would require other things to have to change in Nakamichi's marketing messaging. As for placement, Nakamichi recommends putting the subs in the front corners of your room at a 45-degree angle. I tested this placement and noted that it did help boost the subs' response. However, in our room, subs placed in the left corner, they don't always perform their best. So if this placement isn't possible for you or you find the result isn't what you're after, try placing the subs at the midpoint between the bar and your primary listening position, which is also in keeping with Nakamichi's other recommendation. While we're on the topic of placement, Nakamichi instructs users to place the surround speakers in one of 2 places, slightly behind and to the side of your listening position, or directly to the side of your listening position. I experimented with both recommendations, but ultimately preferred the surrounds placed slightly behind the corners of our 9-foot sofa. Nakamichi also notes that the speaker's drivers should sit more or less in line with your seated ear height. Now, I tested the surrounds on 2 different sets of stands, a budget-friendly pair from Kanto and our reference stands from Solid Steel. Neither stand resulted in dramatically different results, so go with a pair of stands that will place your surrounds at the appropriate height. I should point out that Nakamichi does offer 37-inch stands for about $400, but those would not work in our case, as they would place the rears well above our seated listening position, which goes against Nakamichi's own placement recommendations. The surround speakers also have an adjustable upward firing driver, which Nakamichi calls the perfect height mechanism, allowing you to rotate the driver so that, in theory, the overhead sounds from each driver occur over the primary listening position. Nakamichi also showcases what they call adaptive height effects inside the on-screen menu and app, which work in conjunction with the upward firing drivers, including the ones found within the perfect height mechanism. I'm not sure why they are describing their height speakers as adaptive, though. In my experience, adaptive would imply that the Dragon adjusts to its surroundings automatically, which is not the case with the surrounds or any aspect of the Dragon's performance. It lacks any auto room equalization or correction of any kind, so the adaptive height effects amounts to little more than presets for the upward firing drivers that just range from low, medium, and high. And I tried all three, and to be honest, there wasn't much difference between them. So the moment you've all been waiting for, how does the Dragon sound? Christy and I have waited a long time to hear this thing, so you best believe we both settled in on the couch ready to go. I hit play on the "Are You a God" scene from Ghostbusters Afterlife, and the first thing, and I mean the first thing we noted was how loud and frankly brash this system sounded. The Dragon defaulted to a volume of 30. Straight out of the box. And seeing as how most AVR's volume of 30 out of 100 is kind of quiet, I didn't think to adjust it. And boy, if we weren't awake before, the Dragon slapped us right in the face to be sure we were paying attention. For my techies out there, when sending a test tone through the Dragon at a volume of 30, I measured 98 to 100 dB in room at a distance of 12.5 feet. That is loud enough to sustain hearing damage and was enough for me to put an instant stop to our initial subjective listening test and go to work figuring out just what the bar was doing. So I placed my UMic 1 at our primary listening position at a distance of 12.5 feet from the main bar, and I measured the volume setting for 1 and 2, and they were below the typical noise floor of our room. A volume setting of 3 resulted in an SPL of 60 dB. 6 equaled 67, 9, 76, and 12, 81, which is actually a little louder than I typically listen on any given day. At a volume of 20, I was getting more than 90 decibels, so it would appear that the Dragon doesn't have a great deal of subtlety with volume control and gets to what seems to be its, quote, happy place of pretty loud pretty quickly, which may be something to keep in mind if you have nearby neighbors or sleeping babies to consider. Things like nearby neighbors and other limitations force many of you to consider how a soundbar sounds on its own without the sub or surrounds connected. We always test soundbars with and without their included or optional components because I think it's imperative in understanding what each aspect of the system is doing. When I did this with the Dragon, the results were surprising. On its own, the main bar does not play much below 300 Hertz, regardless of where you set its crossover point. This means that all of the bass, including the low mid-range, plays through the subwoofers. That makes this one of, if not the largest soundbar on the market that is unable to play as low as a Bose 600. Never mind the Sonos Arc, when measured head-to-head. The tiny Bose 600 surprisingly hits 100 Hertz. The Arc, it hits 70. Why am I bringing this up? Well, this means that if the handoff between the Dragon sub and bar isn't seamless, certain instruments, sound effects, and even vocal ranges like mine are going to be split between two speakers, occupying two very different locations in your room. This happens a lot with the Dragon, and it ain't good. From about 300 Hertz on up to 20 kilohertz, the Dragon's bar is impressive, at least on paper. The main bar in Dolby Surround with no EQ preset applied measured more or less linear at a volume of 80 dB in room from a distance of 12.5 feet. Now the bar does lose much of its neutrality the second you apply any of its EQ presets. Speaking of presets, the bar defaults to Movie 2 out of the box. So if you're after accuracy, you need to turn off the presets and set the surround mode to either Dolby Surround or native. Adding the subwoofer in surrounds obviously fleshes out the Dragon's bottom end, but it also brings about a different personality. Well, not so fast. If you set the subs up correctly and you level match them within 3 to 5 dB of the bar in your room and you turn off all EQ presets and set the bar's decoding to native, it will produce a more even response, one that closely resembles what I'll refer to as the Harman curve. You know, a bit of a rise in the bass that tapers slightly downwards as you near the treble. It's a more natural and agreeable sound for the Dragon, though likely not the sound you've been told to expect, nor what the bar gives you out of the box. Out of the box, the bar's default response was more in line with our initial subjective feelings. Bass and volume first, everything else a distant second. It was easy to hear and then later see the handoff between the bar and the sub using any of the bar's default settings. Remember, our subs were placed halfway out in the room for a more even response. The Dragon's bass, it comes on fast and strong, but it dies just as quickly. Despite having 4 woofers spread across 2 subwoofers in what has historically been a very reliable spot for subs in our room, the Dragon subs, they run out of steam right around 40 Hz. And to confirm this, I ran sweeps in intervals of 10 Hz starting at 20 Hz, and the Dragon didn't register in in-room volume until I hit 40. For my curious Carls out there, 30 dB was 15 to 20 dB below 40 Hz, according to 2 different SPL meters, with 20 Hz not even registering at the listening position. I'm not gonna say that the Dragon can't hit 20 Hz, but I don't believe it hits it with any authority, and definitely not in keeping with how most subwoofers report their frequency response. In reality, 20 and 30 Hz sweeps sounded more like distortion than bass. Don't believe me? Here is a literal sound of this happening, and no, this is not going to become a regular thing. Did you hear that? Yeah, it's audible, and using some of my go-to test films like Battleship and Burlesque, the sub totally bottomed out, making that sound. But measurements aside, the handoff between the sub and the bar wasn't as clean as I've experienced through other bars or home theater systems. I believe Nakamichi subs are voiced for maximum impact. So if all you watch are films like Battleship and Top Gun, you may not even notice the gaps that exist between the sub and the bar. But if the scene doesn't call for you to enter the danger zone, this gap is very noticeable. Turning the subs down, now that definitely lessened the presence and audible severity of the gap, but this also made the tonality of the entire system skew more forward. So both solutions are pretty much a wash. I mean, for over a year, all I've heard from viewers is how great the Dragon subwoofers are compared to just everything else. I gotta say, I'm kind of let down. Can the Dragon subs play louder at 40 Hz than maybe a Samsung Q990D? I mean, maybe, but the Dragon sound is very two-dimensional, especially when pushed. And when the subs reach their limit, it's not like they subtly roll off. I mean, they distort like a cheap Honda Civic. On a more positive note, the Dragon's upper mid-range and treble are very clear. The system has zero issues making a statement when it comes to detail and, to a larger extent, intelligibility, especially through the drivers dedicated to the center channel. I would classify the Dragon center focus as being localized, if not a little beamy. Dialogue definitely hits you front and center, which, for some of you, will be a very good thing. But even Christie felt the dialogue could be a little too forward at times, even bordering on shouty if the Dragon got past, a certain volume, so you can only imagine how I felt. Still, I will not deny the Dragon its clarity accolades because it is very crispy. The front, left, right, and center channels are very localized and lack a bit of dispersion. While vertical dispersion is marginally better, horizontal dispersion sounded and measured quite poorly. Even moving a foot or two off center results in as much as a 3 decibel drop in energy, which caused a lot of mixes to sound far more localized than I would have expected from a bar this size. I get that your typical home theater demos, I'm talking about Dolby Atmos specific demos and big movies like Dune, are great for quickly impressing your friends or even the press, especially when time is of the essence, because these types of demos, they're going to present a larger than life sound and they're definitely going to highlight spatial placement. But you actually learn a lot more about a system's capability by broadening the scope of your demo material. So let's put down the obvious demo materials and focus on non-tentpole films with legacy mixes. I'm talking True HD and Dolby Digital. The Dragon becomes a scattered mess with no real front-to-back coherence, never mind overhead effects. Honestly, aside from a handful of Dolby Atmos test tracks and a few key scenes from films like Top Gun Maverick, I wasn't all that impressed by the Dragon's height effects. If I only watched the same 4 demos from Dolby over and over again, I would probably come to a different conclusion, but spatially, the Dragon didn't embarrass much, if any, of its competition. Now, when it comes to dynamics, the Dragon achieves god-tier impact quickly, and if you're not careful, without any warning. You learn real quick that if you hit the volume up button one too many times, the Dragon's just general input delay will make sure you learn, like Pavlov's dog, not to make that mistake too many times. Jokes aside, dynamic impact and headroom are not an issue with the Dragon, and while I never tested its ultimate SPL claims of 125 dB, it was hard enough to be in the room at 110, so I'm confident the Dragon will hit 125, but anytime I went past 90 to maybe stretching it to 95 dB, the Dragon just sounded too forward and too much of just, well, everything that it ceased to be enjoyable. And I get it. I get that not everyone is going to agree with my take on the Dragon. Needless to say, there are a few more non-subjective issues that I need to point out. For starters, the Dragon takes a second to lock on and play back any incoming signal, be it audio or video. Also, on several occasions, the Dragon would fall in and out of sync with the actors on screen, regardless of the source content being viewed. But even more frequent than the sync issues were the audio dropouts in the middle of movies and when watching network broadcasts like the Olympics, especially when streaming through either our Apple TV 4K or the TCL's native apps. I also ran into switching issues when going between the ARC-E, ARC HDMI port, and say HDMI 4, which I had connected to the new Zyto movie server. Powering down or switching to another input and then back to HDMI 4 often remedied this. Nevertheless, it happened. And speaking of associated equipment, I want to applaud Nakamichi's control app for the Dragon. It's actually very educational and makes making adjustments to the bar a lot more straightforward than its outdated on-screen menus. But in order to begin using the app, you will have to provide your email address, something I know many of you watching this frown upon. But from there, Nakamichi also requires you to share your associated equipment, like your TV, your streaming box, gaming console. You get the idea. And there is no way to gain full access to the app without providing at least some of this information. Now, I get that on the surface, this seems like a way for Nakamichi to better assist you with your Dragon. But it feels more like data mining, because telling the Dragon I had a TCL versus, say, a Sony, it didn't result in a different experience, let alone any of the switching and or CEC issues suddenly being fixed. So while it's not uncommon to have to create a user account to, use an app, I've never been asked to provide a list of my equipment, especially when it's equipment connected digitally through HDMI that the Dragon would or should automatically recognize upon making any HDMI connection. Lastly, I just can't excuse the Dragon's lack of modern features. Now, the official story is they did this to maintain the highest possible signal purity. Look, I've worked around AV manufacturing and brands most of my adult life, and too often the word purity is marketing for we just don't want to pay licensing fees or we just lack the resources. I'm not suggesting that I have any insider knowledge that this is what Nakamichi has done, but for a bar that claims and goes so hard in the paint against not only its soundbar peers, but also AVRs, to show up with little more than Bluetooth and a GUI I had on my Yamaha AVR circa 1998, come on. No review of ours is complete without at least a few comparisons, going with some of the obvious competitors like the new Sony Bravia Theater Quad, Samsung Q990D, which we just reviewed, and the even older products like Sonos Ultimate Surround Setup or the original Sennheiser Ambio. The Dragon comes out on top in two categories: physical size and just sheer output. Again, I don't need to test the Dragon's limits to know that in a volume-only cage match, which one of these 5 systems is going to come out on top. Maybe the Ambio gets the closest in matching the size and output of the Dragon, but against the others, the Dragon's going to win. But when it comes to other important aspects one has to consider in a purchase, I'm talking about manageable size, ease of use, simplicity of setup, versatility, better physical and sonic fit for most rooms, modern features like Wi-Fi, AirPlay, smart home connectivity, seriously everything, overall sound quality across the widest range of source material, and even cinematic thrills at more everyday volumes, the Dragon scores dead last for me. If you're on the market for the cinematic equivalent of a sledgehammer, run, don't walk, get yourself a Dragon. But if you expect more from your system than just brute force, you can do as good or better for less by picking up any of the other options I just mentioned. And sweet Mother Teresa on the hood of a benzo is this doubly true when it comes to listening to music. As for the Dragon being a replacement for a traditional home theater system, I don't think it is one. The Dragon can be outclassed by even a modest home theater setup that costs less than whatever you might pay for the Dragon. I don't even need to compare the Dragon to a $14,000 home theater system, even on sale at $3,300 that I paid, which, by the way, makes me a true owner of the Dragon, isn't too difficult to match or best its performance. You can put together an equally satisfying, easier to use, for sure, and a more feature-packed traditional home theater that wouldn't take up really any more space than the Dragon. For example, this Onkyo KLIPSCH home theater that currently retails for less than $3,000. Sure, the KLIPSCH Onkyo home theater doesn't have 15 or 17 channels, but having all of the channels in the world doesn't automatically equal a better surround sound performance, especially when controlled by a system or processor like the one in the Dragon. Sure, it's powerful, but it also takes its cues from the Old Testament. With the KLIPSCH Onkyo combo, you get all of the bells and whistles of modern tech, not to mention the ability to let your system change and grow with you over time. And if I can go out on a limb, I'm going to argue that it's going to sound better. Look, I went into this review with an open mind. Given that this review has been nearly 2 years in the making, the conclusion I really wanted to come to was to be able to look you all in the eye and say, I finally get it, that the Dragon is awesome. Make no mistake, that would have been the easier and way more beneficial conclusion for me to come to. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. Can the Dragon wow you with its sheer presence and volume? Yeah. But is it an answer to home theater prayers? I don't think so. And this is coming from somebody who genuinely loves soundbars and thinks they are absolutely the future. So that's it. That is now my take on Nakamichi's Dragon. I guess it's your turn now. Tell me what you think. Sound off down below. And remember, the only person who has to like the sound of anything is you. So happy listening, everybody. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you on the next video. Bye.